There is a strange paradox that few people speak about openly. The more deeply you understand yourself, the lighter life does not always become. You know why you react the way you do. You can see the recurring patterns. You can name your fears, your wounds, even the darkness within you. And yet, when a familiar situation appears, your body still reacts in the old way. The emotions still rise as they always have. The choices still turn in the same direction. And if you are honest, you may have asked yourself before, so where is all this understanding actually leading me? This does not mean you have not tried hard enough. It does not mean you are not awakened or that you have not healed deeply enough. Many people who have done inner work for years arrive at this place, a sense of standing still while everything inside becomes clearer and sharper. You are no longer confused, but you are not truly free either. You are no longer lost, but you are not fully alive. This is not failure. It is a very subtle threshold in human psychology. Carl Jung pointed out that certain phases of the inner journey do not end with more insight, but with a very different kind of shift, a change in how you show up in everyday life. And this is where many people stop. Not because they do not know, but because knowing is no longer enough to move forward. There comes a moment when self-awareness, instead of opening the way, becomes a safe shelter, a place where you understand everything, but do not yet have to live differently. If you have ever felt as though you are living between two layers, one made of everything you have come to understand, and the other made of a life that still runs on old momentum, then you may be standing at a very specific point on this path. A place where the question is no longer, what am I missing? But where am I avoiding living differently? And it is precisely from here that a stage few people ever complete truly begins. After a long period of inner work, most people reach a very specific state, no longer chaotic, but not truly free either. You are no longer living in complete unconsciousness. You can see what is happening inside you. You understand why you react, why you feel afraid, why you repeat old patterns. But the strange thing is that right here, the journey seems to slow down. Sometimes it even comes to a stop. Not because you turned away from the truth, but because you have grown used to seeing, while you have not yet grown used to living from what you see. Carl Jung once described a psychological phenomenon in which a person begins to accumulate self-awareness like a kind of inner map. You know where you are. You know the road you have walked. You know the pits that once made you stumble. But there is one thing a map cannot do. It cannot force you to move. And many people, after drawing a remarkably detailed map of their inner world, begin to live on the map itself rather than continue the actual journey. This is where self-awareness accidentally becomes an invisible plateau. There is no longer intense pain to force change. There is no longer a crisis big enough to shatter the old structure. Everything seems fine. You understand yourself well enough to avoid major mistakes, well enough to explain your emotions, well enough to say all the right psychological things. Yet deep inside, there is a quiet sense that your life is still running on momentum, while your awareness has moved far ahead. This plateau is especially dangerous not because it creates obvious suffering, but because it is comfortable in a subtle way. You are no longer as confused as before, so you do not feel an urgent need to change. You are no longer lost, so you assume you must be on the right path. But in reality, you may simply be standing still in a place with a very good view. You can see far, but you are not moving. Jung referred to this as a split between consciousness and lived life. Your consciousness knows a great deal, but your body, emotions, and behavior remain loyal to old patterns. You may recognize that you are triggered, yet still react the same way you always do. You may understand where your fear comes from, yet still allow that fear to make your decisions. You may speak clearly about the shadow, yet keep it at a safe distance, close enough to analyze, far enough that you do not have to change. And it is precisely here that a very different kind of fatigue begins to appear. Not fatigue from crisis, not fatigue from suffering, but fatigue from having to maintain two versions of yourself at the same time. One version that is aware, articulate, and awake, able to name everything, and another version that lives by old momentum, reacting along familiar tracks. These two versions coexist within one person, and the daily energy leak comes from the distance between them. What matters is to see clearly that no one gets stuck on this plateau by accident. It exists because it serves a very specific psychological function. Here, you can still feel like you are progressing because you understand more. You can still feel like you are working on yourself because you can analyze very deeply, but you have not yet paid the highest cost. Changing how you show up in ordinary moments where there is no audience, no spiritual label, and no beautiful story to tell about yourself. That is why this plateau can last for years. Nothing is wrong enough to force you to leave. There is only a quiet truth. Insight has completed its role, but you are still using it as a shelter. When this happens, the most important question is no longer, what do I still need to understand? But what am I postponing in my actual life? Most people do not realize they are standing on this invisible plateau. They simply feel a subtle repetition, relationships with different names but the same emotional texture, conflicts with different forms but familiar feelings, decisions that look new but always turn in the same direction. And without a moment of absolute honesty with yourself, this plateau can become the longest place you live on the inner journey. There is something very few people are willing to admit. Understanding does not only liberate, it can also protect what is not yet ready to dissolve. When you gain language for psychology, for shadow, for trauma, for the unconscious, you do not only gain more light, you also gain more explanations. And explanation, if you look closely, can become a very subtle form of delay. At this stage, the ego no longer fights self-awareness. It has learned how to cooperate with it. It does not deny the wound. It tells the story of the wound. It does not avoid the shadow. It analyzes the shadow. It does not resist inner work. It places itself in the role of someone on a journey. And it is precisely this cooperation that makes everything harder to recognize than ever before. Carl Jung once warned that the ego has the capacity to assimilate anything that comes into contact with it, even the deepest experiences. When this happens, understanding no longer functions as a driving force. It becomes a new stable structure. You no longer say, I don't know why I'm like this. You say, I know exactly why I'm like this. But the more important question is quietly bypassed. And what am I doing differently right now? At this point, a strange phenomenon appears. You begin to live inside the interpretation of yourself. Every reaction comes with an explanation. Every conflict has a clear psychological context. Every repeated pattern is placed neatly into a familiar framework of meaning. The confusion is gone, but so is the movement. Your life becomes more understandable, but not deeper. Clearer, but not freer. What makes this state so difficult to leave is not that it hurts, but that it makes sense. You have reasons for everything, reasons why you cannot yet speak honestly in a relationship, reasons why you cannot yet let go of a familiar choice, reasons why you still react the same way. Everything has a psychological origin, and when everything has an origin, nothing feels urgent enough to change. Jung described this as a form of unembodied insight, a state in which consciousness has expanded, but life itself is still being run by old structures. The ego, in its new role, is no longer a crude obstacle. It becomes a subtle manager, ensuring that every transformation stops just before it requires giving up something real. No denial, no resistance, only postponement. And this postponement often wears a very noble disguise. You tell yourself that you are observing a bit more, that you don't need to rush, that everything takes time. These statements are not false, but they can conceal a more uncomfortable truth. Some changes do not come from time, but from a very specific choice you are still avoiding. At this level of the journey, the greatest danger is not unconsciousness, but familiarity. You have become used to understanding yourself, used to standing in the observer's position, used to naming everything without stepping into it. And this familiarity creates a false sense of safety. Safe because you are no longer surprised by yourself, yet locked into the same mode of being. One clear sign of this state is that outer life changes, but inner experience does not. People come and go, jobs shift and transform, circumstances look new, yet the core feeling when facing intimacy, conflict, choice, responsibility remains the same. You may no longer blame yourself as you once did, but you also no longer truly touch what is asking you to live differently. And here, the Jungian question is no longer, what is my shadow? But what is my ego using this understanding to avoid? Not avoiding old pain, but avoiding the dissolution of a familiar identity, the identity of the one who understands, the one who is aware, the one who has gone far on the inner path. Because living differently may require you to let go of that image. Most people do not stop because they are not deep enough. They stop because they have gone deep enough to see that the next step is no longer discovery, but sacrifice. No longer understanding more about yourself, but allowing the old self to lose control over very small, very ordinary moments where there is no Jungian language, no psychological framework, and no beautiful story to tell. And it is precisely here that self-awareness becomes either a doorway or a wall. Not because it is lacking, but because it has completed its function. From this point on, what matters is no longer what you know, but whether you dare to stop using understanding as a shield. There is a paradoxical truth that only appears once you have gone far enough on the inner journey. The ego is not as afraid of pain as we assume. It can endure a great deal of suffering, as long as that suffering is familiar and explainable. What the ego truly fears is not pain, but wholeness, because wholeness requires it to relinquish its central position. Pain, no matter how intense, still allows the ego to exist with a clear role. In pain, the ego can be the victim, the one recovering, the one learning life's lessons. Pain allows the story to continue. Wholeness is different. Wholeness needs no story. Wholeness needs no role. Wholeness does not allow the ego to keep fragmented pieces to lean on. Jung pointed out that the ego may agree to working with the shadow, as long as that work does not require surrendering control. The ego is willing to go deep, analyze, even face difficult memories, as long as it remains the one observing from the outside. But when wholeness begins to emerge, when the boundary between the one who understands and what is understood starts to blur, the ego begins to feel threatened, because wholeness no longer allows you to hide in a role. You cannot say, I react this way because of old wounds, and stop there. You cannot keep saying, I need more time, indefinitely. Wholeness places you before a very simple but uncomfortable demand. Live in alignment with what you have already seen. And it is this consistency that terrifies the ego. Here, a new fear appears more subtle than the fear of pain. It is the fear of having no reason. When you are in pain, you have a reason to defend yourself. When you are wounded, you have a reason to keep distance. When you are in process, you have a reason not to change yet. But when wholeness begins to knock, those reasons gradually lose their power. And the ego, which survives on reasons, begins to feel exposed. This explains why many people unconsciously choose to remain with familiar pain rather than step into a state that is less dramatic but demands greater responsibility. Pain allows reaction. Wholeness demands presence. Pain allows repetition. Wholeness demands choice. And choice, when there is no story left to lean on, becomes frightening. Jung described this moment as the point where the ego confuses the dissolution of its power with self-destruction. From the ego's perspective, no longer standing at the center feels like death, but from the perspective of the self, the whole being, it is simply a reorganization. You do not disappear. You are no longer fragmented to maintain a particular image. This is why, as people approach wholeness, many experience a vague, hard-to-name unease, not intense panic, not a clear crisis, but a subtle hesitation, as if something would be wrong if they truly moved forward. You may find yourself returning to old reactions, not because you do not know another way, but because that other way no longer gives the ego a familiar role to play. At this deeper level, the question is no longer, what am I afraid of? But rather, if I stop breaking myself into pieces in order to explain myself, who would I be? And that question, for the ego, is more frightening than any painful memory, because pain still allows the old structure to survive. Wholeness does not. The paradox is this: wholeness does not arrive through a dramatic leap. It does not appear as a transcendent state. It begins very quietly, the moment you stop using pain to justify familiar choices. And it is precisely this quietness that makes wholeness hard for the ego to detect and even harder to control. Most people are not stuck because they are unwilling to endure more pain. They are stuck because they are not ready to release the role that pain has given them. And once you see this, you begin to understand why so few people complete this stage. It does not give you the feeling of progress, only a very simple demand to live as someone who no longer needs to protect themselves with a story. There comes a time when every concept, every psychological language, every piece of inner understanding can no longer shield you. Not because they are wrong, but because life begins to ask a different question. Not, what do you understand? But how are you living? And this question is not asked in therapy sessions or meditation retreats, but in ordinary moments. A conversation, a career decision, a boundary being tested, a relationship that demands real presence. This moment is rarely dramatic. It does not arrive with a major crisis or special spiritual signs. It appears when you realize that all your familiar ways of avoiding have already been exposed. You can still explain, but explanation no longer eases the unease. You can still analyze, but analysis no longer brings relief. Life begins to respond honestly. Whatever is no longer lived in alignment starts to feel heavy. Jung described this as the moment when the self, the whole being, no longer accepts being postponed, not through punishment, but through natural consequences. Relationships begin to feel draining. Jobs that once fit start to feel hollow. Choices that once felt safe begin to feel constricting. There is no obvious disaster, only the sense that you cannot continue living the same way without paying the price in life energy. Here, wholeness is no longer an inner concept. It becomes a concrete requirement. You cannot keep saying, I understand why I stay silent, when that silence erodes truth in a relationship. You cannot keep saying, I am healing, when your daily decisions still betray what you have already seen. There is no more middle ground, no buffer zone for subtle postponement. What makes this moment uncomfortable is that it offers no drama. There is no victim role to hide in, no grand story to justify yourself. Only small, repeated choices, where you either move toward wholeness or return to a familiar structure you have already seen through. And precisely because you have seen through it, going back hurts more than ever. Many people mistake this feeling for loss of motivation or an existential crisis. But in truth, it is the conflict between what you know is true and how you are still living. There is no unconsciousness left to blame, no unnamed shadow, only a clear inconsistency, and that inconsistency begins to drain you from the inside. At this level, life becomes a mirror that cannot be negotiated with. You can avoid a conversation, but the cost is quiet distance. You can stay in an ill-fitting job, but the cost is exhaustion. You can keep pleasing others, but the cost is the gradual disappearance of yourself. Wholeness does not shout, it settles accounts through energy. Jung once said that the greatest danger is not confronting the unconscious, but living against what you already know. Because then the conflict is no longer between light and shadow, but between recognized truth and behavior that has not yet caught up. And this conflict, if prolonged, makes life heavy enough that you are eventually forced to choose. The moment of no more hiding often arrives in very ordinary ways. The moment you say yes while your entire body says no. The moment you stay silent and clearly see that you have just betrayed what you believe. The moment you watch an old pattern unfold and realize that no amount of further understanding can save you from this choice, only different action can. And it is here that wholeness begins to collect its debt, not through dramatic pain, but through deep fatigue from living out of alignment with your inner axis. You begin to understand that the cost of not crossing this threshold is no longer not evolving enough, but the loss of vital energy. You still exist, you still function, but you are no longer truly alive. Most people stop just before this moment because it gives them no new identity, no new story, no additional recognition. It places before them only one naked question. Are you willing to let your life reflect what you have already seen? No one else can answer that for you. And if you are feeling that old strategies no longer work, that understanding yourself no longer brings relief, that life is quietly applying pressure, it may not mean you are on the wrong path. It may mean you have arrived at the place where you are no longer allowed to hide behind insight. The place where wholeness is no longer an ideal, but a condition for living more lightly. Living from wholeness does not create a higher person. It does not make you calm all the time, erase conflict, or turn life into a series of enlightened moments. In fact, from the outside, the life of someone living from wholeness may look quite ordinary. The difference lies in how they show up in familiar situations. First, wholeness appears as alignment between what you feel and what you do. When you do not want something, you begin to say no without needing a long story to justify it. When you want something, you allow yourself to admit that desire without shaming yourself. Not because you are fully healed, but because you no longer split yourself into opposing camps, one that feels and one that controls. In daily communication, living from wholeness does not mean saying everything. It means not saying what contradicts your inner truth. You may choose silence, but that silence does not come from fear. You may choose to speak, but not to protect an image. Your body no longer has to tense itself to play the right role, because there is no role left to maintain. In relationships, wholeness does not make you cold or distant. On the contrary, it makes boundaries clear and flexible. You no longer love to fill a void, attach to soothe anxiety, or withdraw to protect yourself. When conflict arises, you recognize the difference between emotions that are surfacing and the behavior you choose. You may still feel fear, but you do not let fear drive the entire conversation. One very clear sign of wholeness is this: you respond more slowly, not because you suppress yourself, but because there is now space between stimulus and response. In that space, you no longer ask, "What should I do to be right?" You simply recognize, "What is true for me right now?" And from that truth, action emerges naturally. In work, living from wholeness does not necessarily mean changing careers or pursuing a higher calling. Many people continue in the same jobs, but the inner motivation has shifted. You no longer work to prove your worth, to hide a sense of lack, or to sacrifice yourself to maintain a good image. You work because that is how your energy wants to move outward, and when you are tired, you stop, without needing to collapse before allowing yourself to rest. Wholeness also changes your relationship with mistakes. When you act out of alignment with your inner axis, you notice it sooner and correct it earlier. No self-punishment, no psychological justification, just adjustment. Wholeness does not demand perfection. It demands ongoing honesty. One crucial point: living from wholeness does not feel special. You no longer feel like you are on a higher level. In fact, you may feel more ordinary than before, less intense, less dramatic. And this confuses many people because they once associated inner growth with powerful emotional states. But wholeness does not require intensity. It requires sustainability. In your inner life, one change becomes very clear. There is less war. No more constant tension between who I should be and who I am. You do not need to monitor yourself endlessly or analyze every reaction. Not because you have become unconscious, but because your inner parts have begun to cooperate rather than compete for control. Carl Jung emphasized that the sign of psychological maturity is not elevated insight, but the ability to live an ordinary life without betraying oneself. Wholeness, therefore, is not a state to achieve, but a way of living repeated in small choices. How you reply to a message, how you set a boundary, how you stay or leave, how you care for your body when no one is watching. And finally, perhaps most important of all, living from wholeness does not solve every problem, but it ends one fundamental problem: living against yourself. When that ends, life energy begins to return, not as excitement, but as a quiet steadiness. You no longer need to convince anyone that you have changed. You simply notice that life no longer has to drag you forward. You are walking with it. If you look back on this journey, it does not lead you to a higher version of yourself. It does not grant you a new identity, a spiritual label, or a sense of inner victory. The only thing it truly does is remove what is no longer necessary, the stories you once used to understand yourself, protect yourself, and at times postpone living truthfully with yourself. Carl Jung once said that the aim of psychological life is not perfection, but wholeness. And wholeness, as you have seen, is not a state you reach and then hold on to. It is a way of being that is chosen again and again in very ordinary moments where no one is watching and no reward is given. You may not feel finished. There may be no clear moment of enlightenment, but you will notice a very subtle shift. You no longer have to convince yourself so much. You no longer have to drag yourself through life. You no longer live between two layers, one of understanding and one of behavior that cannot keep up. As that split slowly closes, energy begins to return naturally. This does not mean you will never feel fear, hesitation, or misalignment again. It simply means that when these things arise, you recognize them more quickly and more honestly. You do not need to turn them into a grand story, nor hide behind analysis. You adjust and you keep living. And if there is one thing worth remembering from this entire journey, it may be this: you are not stuck because you lack understanding, and you are not slow because you have not tried hard enough. You are simply standing in a place where understanding is no longer the next step, where life begins to ask you, not what have you seen, but from where are you living? If the old ways no longer bring relief, if understanding yourself no longer makes life lighter, that may not be a sign that you are on the wrong path. It may be a sign that you have gone far enough to no longer be allowed to hide behind insight. From here on, there is no formula for you, and no one can walk the way on your behalf. There is only a very quiet choice, repeated each day, to live in a way that does not betray your inner truth through your outer life. Not perfectly, not exceptionally, just without further splitting yourself. And sometimes, that very refusal to split is the deepest form of freedom a human being can reach.